Hi, my name is Raymond Tim, and I want to thank you for this opportunity to give this talk remotely on steelhead conservation, coping with thermal barriers in a warming planet. I had planned to be at this meeting, and then things got complicated for me, and I couldn't make the trip. So it's really great to still be able to talk with you. But before I do anything, I need to recognize my co-authors, Robert Wismar and Renee Holland at the University of Washington, and Chris Frizzell of Frizzell and Raven and the University of Montana. This is really all their work, and I'm just giving the presentation. So we're talking about steelhead, and steelhead are an anadromous form of Oncorhynchus mykiss, and their range generally is from Southern California in the United States around the North Pacific into eastern Russia and the Kamchatka Peninsula. We're going to focus in on some populations in Central Oregon and in Northern California. And of course, in any biological conservation conversation about thermal barriers, you really need to frame it in the context of the climate. And so, um, what the global circulation models that are predicting climate changes are suggesting is that in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, we're expecting to see some shifts in precipitation timing and intensity, and particularly in form. And the form part of this equation is important because right now, most of our wintertime precipitation falls at high elevation in the form of snow. And what the models are suggesting is going to happen increasingly in the future is that we'll get more intense precipitation in the form of warm rain. And so we won't have snowpack that will melt late into the spring and summer, providing cold water for our headwater streams where a lot of these fish are spending their juvenile life histories. These same climate models are suggesting that by the 2020s, we might see a 2-degree increase in temperature and about a 1.5% increase in precipitation with much more variability than currently. And then by the 2080s, we could see 5-degree increase in temperature and about 4% increase in precipitation with much more variability than we see now. And in terms of maximum stream temperatures, for cold water salmonid fishes, um, in as little as about 25 years from now, these models are suggesting that the geography of suitable habitats could be decreased to only be about a third of what the extent is currently. So that presents some interesting challenges for the conservation of cold water fish. In a warming planet. And when you think about temperature in a stream ecosystem, what you see is that it's this very patchy phenomenon, and there are places where it's very warm and places where it's cool. And this occurs both in space, so longitudinally upstream, but then also through time, so day to day. And the patchiness of some of these intense differences in temperature exist both in meters and in hours. So they can change, but they can also be intense enough as to preclude movement from one habitat type to another, in which case we would say that they were barriers. So how do these kinds of barriers affect juvenile steelhead? This is an important biological conservation question. And for the purposes of this talk, we're kind of taking a four-pronged look at this question. And the first is that thermal refugia are present and heavily used by fish. And I think this is generally accepted that um, there are places in stream ecosystems that are more suitable or more preferred based on the environmental conditions than other places. And if you've ever stuck your head underwater and looked around, you know that this is true because you see places where there's a lot of biotic use of a particular habitat type relative to others. The second idea here is that there are these thermal traps and that migrating fish can get caught behind thermal or flow barriers and then end up being concentrated in warm water where they would normally avoid if conditions were different. And these places can be transient, like we saw in the previous view graph, where maybe on a daily basis the temperature becomes more favorable and fish can move in and out, or they could be more long term in that a fish might move into a particular habitat when conditions are good, and then flow drops, for example, and they get isolated and stuck and can't get out, in which case they would experience some physiological stress or mortality. And then there are a couple of other hypotheses that we're looking at here, and one is this idea of interspecific competitive release, and that is that as other species disappear, given the thermal experience that they're having. For example, coho and Chinook salmon tend to have maximum thermal tolerances around 17 and 22 degrees C, respectively. So as they drop out of the picture, steelhead may benefit from a lack of competition. So these juvenile steelhead that may be more capable of dealing with warm water temperatures in the absence of competition from other species may do okay. Um, And then finally, there's this idea of a thermal ecotype where long-term environmental forcing results in a thermally tolerant ecotype that wouldn't normally be dominant in cooler waters. And so if these fish are capable of adapting to warmer conditions, then they might be able to persist until conditions change again. And you definitely see this with Oncorhynchus mykiss. This is a photo that Joe Ebersol took back in the mid 90s in the John Day River ecosystem in north central Oregon. And what you can see here clearly is that there's a lot of fish use in this zone between about 17 and 19 degrees. And that's where all the fish are concentrated. So they're capable of finding these places, even though they may be very small in space. And then they use them heavily as thermal refugia. And these patches of suitable habitat can be large in space and of long duration. And in this top instance here, what you would see is that pretty much everywhere within the system is suitable habitat, and so every place would be good. But this isn't really how stream ecosystems work. Generally, what we've seen in stream ecosystems is that you have small patches of habitat that are favorable and preferred, and then those are separated by other areas that are less favorable or less preferred. And if these things are close enough that a fish could move from one patch of favorable habitat to another without experiencing stress or mortality, then we'd say that the system was still functionally connected. But what we see increasingly, and what we expect to see increasingly as the climate continues to change, is that we get these isolated patches that have either long distances or kind of extreme conditions that would separate them from another isolated patch of suitable habitat. And in these instances, if a fish were not capable of moving from one to another without experiencing stress or mortality, then we would say that these are barriers and they're functionally disconnected stream ecosystems. And this is what we're concerned about in a biological conservation sense, especially as the climate is changing into the future. So the regulatory agencies, both the United States Environmental Protection Agency and some of the state governments like the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, come up with criteria for what they think are suitable for Endangered Species Act listed salmonids. And in Oregon, that temperature criterion is an 18-degree threshold, and in the US EPA says that for ESA listed fish, it's 17. And the criterion we're talking about is this 7 DAD max. It's the 7-day average daily maximum temperature. It's a moving average of any 7-day period. And the idea is that when water temperatures exceed that, then you're outside of compliance with the water quality guidelines for these fish. And what you can see here in the West Fork of the Smith River is that um, the water is out of compliance almost all the time, and even as we go upstream where uh, water generally cools down. Well, what does this mean for steelhead? Well, steelhead generally have two kind of major phases in their life. There's the ocean phase where the small fish go to the ocean and they eat and grow and mature, and then they come back to the freshwater and reproduce. And so they'll lay their eggs in the stream beds where their embryos and fry will develop. And then as they emerge from the gravel, the juveniles will spend up to 2 years before they move back out to the ocean and repeat the process. So we know that steelhead spawn during the late winter and early spring, and they can have variable migration timing, but generally their spawn timing is late winter and early spring. And the juvenile habitat use is highly variable, particularly during the summer when the relative importance of habitat types can shift because um, there is inter and intra-specific competition. The habitat volumes start to decrease as discharge drops, and fish can be moved into habitats that would otherwise be suboptimal for whatever their particular life needs are at the moment. These juvenile fish, as age 0 fish, are usually about less than 10 centimeters long and weigh about a gram. And as age 1 plus fish can be longer than 10 centimeters and about 10 grams before they head to the ocean. The published values for suitable temperatures for juvenile steelhead, the rearing age 0 and 1 plus fish, is between about 13 and 15 degrees, and their thermal experience is as incubating embryos and developing fry, excuse me, it's generally between about 4 and 9 degrees. Um, and of course, we know that these water temperatures can be influenced by atmospheric conditions, changes in stream and groundwater, discharge dynamics, and anthropogenic factors like urbanization. Again, to reorient a little, what we're talking about here are a couple of Oregon coastal streams as well as some Northern California streams, and this is the Umpqua River system in central coastal Oregon, the Trinity River, and the American River in Northern California. And our elevation ranges go from about sea level here, where the Umpqua dumps into the ocean, to the top of the American River. That's about 2,400 meters in elevation. Our watershed areas, some of these smaller tributaries in the Umpqua system, are about 300 square kilometers, um, and the Trinity drains about 7,400 square kilometers. So those are some of the physical characteristics of the watersheds we looked at. In the Umpqua system, what we see is that generally, when you're looking at temperature, almost all the water, almost all the time, exceeds the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality uh, temperature standards for ESA listed fish. And the same is true for the US EPA standard. The one notable exception there is that Spring Creek seems to be much cooler than the others. It's also kind of an interesting thing to observe that generally, as you go upstream, temperature tends to decrease, and we think this is mostly owing to increases in elevation. But when you look at age zero fish densities in the same system, in the Umpqua River system, what you see is that most of the fish are having a thermal experience that is an exceedance of what the regulatory agencies suggest is an important criterion for these ESA listed fish. So either these age zero fish can't move to um, suitable habitat, or they're tolerant of this kind of temperature range, or it's also possible that we're not measuring the temperature at the same grain as the fish are experiencing it. So these fish could be finding thermal refugia that we're just not seeing in our thermistors because our thermistors were not placed in the correct locations. That's a possibility. And the same thing for age 1+ fish. Although it is important to note that these densities are between 2 and 20-fold less dense than the age 0 fish. So there's been some outmigration or movement to different places in these systems where perhaps they're looking for more tolerable temperatures. But again, most of these fish are experiencing temperatures um, at our measurement grain that are uh, in exceedance of what the regulatory guidelines are for these ESA listed fish. So the management question seems to be, what can managers do in order to address these thermal barriers affecting steelhead? And it's not just steelhead, but all cold water or salmonid fishes. Um, and the number one really obvious one is that there has to be enough water for these fish at the right times of the year. Um, in order to make sure that their habitat is connected and sufficiently diverse so that they could move from patch to patch of suitable and preferred habitat without experiencing stress or mortality. And that means that the riparian and hypereic functions have to be there to provide the temperature buffers um, and the cooling necessary for these fish to actually move into refugia when they need them. And of course, we need to make sure that we're reducing anthropogenically induced warm water sources wherever we can. And that means, as I mentioned before, the dam discharges are not too warm, and irrigation return water, that we're not getting industrial discharges of warm water into these systems, etc. And I think we're going to move into a system where we're developing new regime-based temperature criteria that pays more attention to the survival of juvenile steelhead and the particular needs of the native biota for each of these stream ecosystems. And the regime-based temperature criteria will look at what the discharge regimes are as well as other watershed conditions. And of course, the pressing conservation question is how will these steelhead survive thermal barriers as the climate continues to warm and we see more and increased anthropogenic forcing, which I think is safe to expect. The answers I think are that avoidance is an important one. Fish are very good at avoidance. They move around all the time and they always have. And they can move within and between habitats, within streams and river channels, and also they can move from streams to main stem rivers and main stem rivers back into tributaries, and from main stem rivers into floodplains. And ultimately, if they survive that, they make it to emigrate to the ocean, where they face a whole different suite of challenges and benefits. But then the freshwater temperature part is not uh, really the pressing question for them. And for sure, they need cold water refuge habitats that are going to be there so that they can survive the movement between thermally impacted areas. And if these places are barriers, well, then we just got to hope that these thermal refugia can maintain suitable temperatures until connectivity is restored. And then there's this idea that they're adapting, and of course, Darwin. This is Darwinian, that these fish can adapt to these warm water temperatures, and that there's an emergence of ecotypes that are capable of withstanding these warm temperatures. And we do see this in O. mykiss in some of the subspecies that are restricted to desert habitat areas, and they seem to be tolerant of temperatures that are much warmer than those that coastal steelhead experience, and they can survive them without physiological stress. So it is possible that O. mykiss can potentially become tolerant of a warmer uh, environment into the future that will allow for them to persist throughout their current range. But the big challenge is that right now what we see is that even though some of these fish can survive these warmer temperatures, their productivity is much lower than it is in the cooler water ecotypes, and so um, persistence is necessary for biological conservation, of course, but productivity remains a pressing conservation question, in that um, they may be able to survive within parts of their range as the climate continues to change and warm, but we should also expect that there's going to be a decrease in productivity. And with that, I apologize that I'm not there to have a conversation with you in person, but if you'd like to ask me any questions, I invite you to email me at ray.tim@fishsciences.net. Thank you again.